While a fairy witch is a polytheist. Of course, it may be equally true to say that a fairy witch could be called a Kaliak or Kaliak Fassa as well, with the added overtones of ambivalence that fairy doctor lacks. I think it is important for anyone pursuing this path to understand the older terms, their meanings and applications, and the use of the word witch both historically and in this text. I think this helps modern practitioners better understand the roots of the practices and beliefs and the way in which modern fairy witches draw on the historic precedents. Much of the witchcraft aspect of fairy witchcraft is formed from a particularly Irish and more broadly Celtic understanding of witches, and particularly the way that witches interacted with the fair folk. In his book, Irish Customs and Beliefs, Kevin Danaher relates an experience he had as a child on holiday in Clare. While exploring, he ran across an older woman named Nellie, who he later learned was reputed throughout the area for her herbal cures and willingness to curse anyone who offended her. He described his thoughts on the experience this way. On the way home that day, I couldn't help thinking that the old lady was very much like the witch in the storybooks. The black cat on the hearth and the heather besom behind the door were just what a witch should have. And when I heard of her cures and curses, my suspicion grew. But I soon found out that the classic figure of the witch cleaving the night air on a broomstick with her cat perched on the pillion was not recognized in local tradition. Old Nellie might have been a Banfassa, skilled in cures and in divination, or even an old Kaliak who stole the cow's milk disguised as a hare. But not a witch. Danaher's description helps to show us that in Irish tradition, particularly older tradition, the idea of the witch was divorced from the more popular one most of us grew up with. Witches were not known as evil beings who made pacts with the devil, flew on brooms, or used their powers to torment their neighbors, but rather as women who had occult knowledge that could be used for good or ill. That is not to say that witches were seen in a good light, because they did have their darker side, being known to work magic on cattle and steal milk. It is important to note that these are some of the same activities engaged in by the fairies themselves, who also hold an ambivalent place in people's minds. It was only later that the idea of the evil witch as a force working against the community appeared in Ireland, and this seems to have been imported from Europe and Scotland. Instead, what we find in Ireland is the idea of different types of magic workers, notably the fairy doctors, Banfassa, and Kaliak, who may all be called witches in English, but who range from benevolent to vexing. In fairy witchcraft, we use the term witch in its modern context, as a person who is both pagan and a practitioner of folk magic. In Irish culture, the word witch might actually be applied to three different groups of people: Kylie, singular Kaliak, fairy doctors, and Mana Fassa, singular Ban Fassa. Although each term has a different, nuanced meaning, all of them are sometimes used interchangeably, and a single person who gains knowledge from the fairies and works magic may be called by any of these traditional titles or by the English word witch. This fluid understanding of the different labels is shared by the liminal nature of fairy witches. Another thing that shows us the difference between the Irish views of witches and the one found elsewhere is the rarity of witch trials found in Ireland. Ireland had very few witch trials over the centuries, and these were usually within settlements of those of non-Irish descent. The last witch trial on record in Ireland occurred in Carrickfergus in 1711 and resulted in a conviction and a sentence of the pillory and a year in prison. This seems to reflect the different attitude with which the Irish approached the subject compared to the far more rabid witch hunting that went on in Europe. Perhaps because the beliefs about witches were not as severe, or perhaps because the belief in the supernatural and use of magic in folklore was so strong even after Christianization, the Irish witch never created the hysteria in Ireland that was the hallmark of Europe during this period. What is particularly worth noting is the connection between Irish and Scottish witches and fairies. The knowledge gained from the fairies can be used to heal or to harm. The witch, or Kaliak, knows how to use